Picture a guy in his 50s. He's a veteran, Navy, maybe Air Force, spent years working around shipboard radar and ground-based tracking stations. He did his job. He didn't ask questions. The equipment worked, the mission got done, and eventually he came home. Now he's sitting across from a VA claims examiner, and he's trying to explain why his cataracts came in 20 years early, why the headaches never really stopped, why he's been reading about microwave radiation at 2 in the morning, trying to find a medical study that says what he already knows in his gut, that all those years standing next to energized radar equipment might have cost him something. And the examiner looks at the file and says, "There's no documentation of exposure, no dose records, no safety log. Without documentation, there's no presumption of harm." The veteran drove home. He knows exactly where he stood. He remembers the heat off the waveguide, the hum of the transmitter cycling up, the way the antenna rotated overhead while he was doing maintenance because shutting it down wasn't operationally convenient. He doesn't have a paper trail. He has a body. And for 30 years, the system has treated those two things as very different kinds of evidence. This is the story of radar radiation exposure, what it was, who it affected, and why the people closest to it were the last ones anyone asked about it. By the time the Second World War was fully underway, radar was everywhere. It sat in steel compartments aboard ships, bolted into aircraft fuselages, mounted on towers along coastlines, and buried inside remote early warning stations. Technicians climbed into cramped spaces to tune and repair transmitters that ran around the clock. Operators stared at glowing scopes for hours at a stretch. Radar wasn't a battlefield tool people picked up and put down. It was infrastructure, and infrastructure creates routine. The systems of that era were powerful, experimental, and poorly understood by almost everyone who worked near them. They transmitted energy at levels far beyond anything civilians ever encountered, often just a few feet from people maintaining them. But because radar produced no immediate, dramatic injury, no burns, no visible wound, no sudden illness, it was treated as benign. Non-ionizing radiation, the thinking went, couldn't cause lasting harm. That assumption became policy, and policy, once it hardens, is very hard to change. What mattered was performance, detection range, target resolution, reliability in bad weather. Safety was secondary at best and irrelevant at worst. Systems stayed energized during maintenance. Personnel stood directly in front of active antennas. Power levels climbed year after year as detection requirements expanded. There were no exposure logs, no warning signs, and no meaningful concept of what it might mean to absorb that kind of energy over a 20-year career. To the engineers designing these systems, radar was a miracle. It shortened wars, protected fleets, and gave commanders the one thing they needed most: time. To the men working closest to it, it was just part of the job. You didn't question it any more than you questioned the engine room or the flight deck. You trusted that if it were dangerous, someone would have said so. Nobody said so. Radar works by sending out energy and listening for what comes back. A transmitter emits electromagnetic waves. Those waves strike an object, and part of that energy returns to a receiver. From the timing and direction of the signal, the system calculates range, bearing, and speed. Simple in concept, complicated in practice, especially when you start asking what those waves do to the people nearby. Radar operates in the microwave portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's non-ionizing radiation, meaning it doesn't have enough energy to strip electrons from atoms or break DNA directly the way an X-ray does. That distinction became the foundation of every early safety assumption. Non-ionizing became a synonym for harmless, and that equation stuck for decades. But biology doesn't care about categories on a chart. It responds to energy transfer. Microwave radiation deposits energy into tissue primarily as heat. At high enough levels, that heating is obvious and damaging. At lower levels, it's subtler. Temperature increases that are localized, uneven, and easy to miss, especially when exposure comes in short pulses rather than as sustained heat. The fact that it doesn't cause immediate cellular disruption doesn't mean it has no effect. It means the effects are slower, harder to measure, and much easier to deny. Certain tissues are particularly vulnerable. The lens of the eye has poor blood flow and limited ability to dissipate heat. As early as the 1950s, studies were documenting higher than expected rates of cataracts among radar technicians. Those findings were real, but they were narrow, and they didn't fit neatly into broader risk models. The nervous system presented an even greater challenge. Nerve tissue is sensitive to both temperature and electrical interference, but its responses are subjective and variable. Headaches, dizziness, cognitive changes, symptoms that are easy to dismiss as stress, bad sleep, or the ordinary wear of military life. And then there was the problem of overlapping hazards. Radar operators and technicians rarely worked around radar alone. They were also exposed to solvents, fuels, asbestos, extreme heat, and chronic occupational stress. When health problems showed up decades later, radar was just one variable among many, easy to set aside, nearly impossible to isolate, and convenient to leave unproven. Radar entered the Second World War as an experimental advantage and came out of it as a strategic necessity. The urgency of war left no room for extended safety studies. The people working closest to radar systems became part of a massive, unintentional experiment, one that nobody designed, nobody tracked, and nobody ever reported on. Early installations were crude by any modern standard. Shipboard systems were crammed into tight compartments surrounded by steel bulkheads that reflected energy in unpredictable patterns. Airborne radar was squeezed into aircraft already struggling with weight and power constraints. Ground stations placed transmitters and operators wherever the terrain allowed, not where exposure would be minimized. Shielding, when it existed at all, was minimal. Maintenance doctrine made it worse. Systems were expected to stay operational during troubleshooting because powering down radar could leave a ship blind or an aircraft vulnerable. Technicians routinely worked on energized transmitters and waveguides. There were no lockout procedures, no posted exclusion zones, no reliable way to measure what anyone was actually absorbing. If the radar worked, it stayed on. Reports of discomfort surfaced during the war, but they weren't taken seriously. Headaches, nausea, eye irritation, a fatigue that didn't track with sleep cycles. These complaints were almost always attributed to stress, seasickness, or the general misery of wartime service. There was no framework for connecting them to radar, because radar wasn't supposed to cause harm. By the time the war ended, hundreds of thousands of service members had spent years working around high-power systems with no baseline health data and no exposure records whatsoever. The systems were decommissioned, personnel rotated out, life moved on. The absence of mass casualties was taken as evidence of safety. Radar hadn't left obvious scars. That silence was interpreted as confirmation, and it hardened into institutional confidence that would prove very difficult to dislodge, especially when the Cold War arrived and the systems got significantly more powerful. The end of World War II didn't slow radar development, it accelerated it. What had been a tactical advantage became a strategic backbone. The threat was no longer aircraft appearing over the horizon. It was bombers and missiles arriving with little warning and catastrophic consequences. To meet that threat, radar systems grew larger, more powerful, and more numerous than anything the wartime era had produced. Long-range ground stations scanned thousands of miles of airspace continuously. Naval radar evolved to support missile guidance and fire control. Air defense networks ran around the clock, not just during combat operations. Transmitters pushed into higher power ranges to achieve greater detection distance. Antennas grew in size and output. Pulse systems delivered intense bursts of microwave energy thousands of times per second. The personnel operating all of this were expected to adapt. Operators and technicians were stationed at remote sites for months or years at a time. Radar domes and antenna fields became permanent workplaces. In many installations, the living quarters, maintenance areas, and control rooms were all located within the same exposure envelope, and distance, still the single most effective protective measure, was still largely unavailable. By this point, military researchers were aware that radar could produce measurable heating near antennas and waveguides. Those findings were documented, but they didn't trigger a fundamental reassessment. The prevailing belief was that any heating significant enough to cause injury would be obvious and immediate. If personnel weren't being burned, the system was assumed to be safe. Exposure was managed through informal habits, not measured standards. Stay clear of the antenna face when possible. Don't linger unnecessarily near waveguides. These were suggestions passed from one technician to the next, varying widely between units and commands, with no scientific basis and no way to verify whether they were actually working. Cumulative exposure was still not tracked. Radar operators were not treated as a distinct occupational risk group. There were no long-term health monitoring programs tied specifically to radar duty. Personnel rotated between assignments, sometimes spending a decade around high-power systems without a single document that could later reconstruct their exposure history. By the time formal exposure standards began to emerge, an entire generation had already served under assumptions that were never fully tested. The technology had matured. The safety doctrine had not. By the time serious questions were raised about radar exposure, the problem wasn't technological, it was biological. Radar systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do. The uncertainty lay in how living tissue responded to repeated, long-term microwave exposure, and that question turned out to be far harder to answer than anyone expected. Laboratory studies offered limited clarity. Animal experiments demonstrated biological effects at certain exposure levels, but translating those findings to human occupational settings was difficult. Exposure conditions in a lab rarely matched the complex, intermittent patterns experienced by a radar operator over a 20-year career. Some studies suggested thresholds below which no effects appeared. Others found effects that couldn't be reliably reproduced. Inconsistency became the central obstacle. Science depends on repeatability, and radar exposure didn't produce clean, repeatable outcomes. Instead, it produced probabilities, correlations, and edge cases. The absence of exposure records compounded everything. Without detailed logs of power levels, distances, and duration, researchers were forced to reconstruct exposure histories from memory and incomplete service records. By the time symptoms appeared, the systems involved were often obsolete, dismantled, or classified, making retrospective analysis nearly impossible. The more researchers looked, the clearer it became that the evidence gap wasn't a neutral absence of data. It was a consequence of institutional delusions made decades earlier, when nobody thought to ask the question. Scientific uncertainty doesn't mean absence of effect. It means the evidence doesn't align neatly enough to satisfy institutional standards of proof. For radar exposure, that gap between what could be proven in a courtroom or a claims office and what was actually being experienced by veterans became the defining feature of the entire debate, shaping policy, compensation decisions, and recognition for decades to come. For the men who'd spent their careers around radar, the debate was never abstract. It was personal, delayed, and deeply frustrating. Symptoms didn't appear during service, when cause and effect might have been visible. They appeared years later, long after uniforms had been put away and service records had been boxed, archived, or lost. Former radar operators and technicians began reporting patterns that were hard to ignore. Cataracts forming unusually early, chronic headaches and neurological complaints that resisted early diagnosis. Cancers appearing without obvious risk factors. Individually, each case could be explained away. Collectively, they raised questions that institutions were slow to address. When veterans sought answers, they encountered a system built around documentation and certainty, and radar exposure, by its nature, had produced neither. The official position was consistent for decades. Radar was non-ionizing, and therefore not presumed to cause long-term harm. Claims were evaluated case by case, with a burden of proof placed squarely on the veteran. Without clear epidemiological data or recognized presumptive conditions, most claims failed. Veterans were asked to prove what power levels they'd been exposed to, how long they'd stood near energized systems, and whether that exposure exceeded limits that hadn't existed at the time. This wasn't a neutral standard. It was, practically speaking, an impossible one. The pattern wasn't new. Asbestos exposure followed a similar trajectory. Decades passed before its risks were officially recognized, and by then the people most affected had already spent years fighting for acknowledgement. Burn pit exposure would repeat the cycle for a new generation. In each case, the absence of early data delayed recognition, and that delay shifted the burden onto the people least equipped to carry it. Institutional caution isn't inherently malicious. Agencies are supposed to rely on evidence. But when evidence is impossible to obtain retroactively, a strict evidentiary standard can function as denial by default. For many veterans, the issue was never about proving radar caused a specific illness. It was about acknowledgement, recognition that risk had existed, that assumptions had been made on their behalf, and that those assumptions had consequences. The refusal to acknowledge even the possibility of harm wasn't just a policy position. It was a second injury on top of the first one. Formal radar safety standards didn't emerge because the technology became safer. They emerged because the assumptions underlying the old doctrine could no longer hold. As systems grew more powerful and more ubiquitous, and as civilian industries began raising similar questions about microwave radiation, the absence of any clear exposure limits became increasingly difficult to justify. By the late Cold War era, the military and regulatory bodies began implementing measurable controls. Exposure limits were defined based on power density, distance, and duration. Minimum safe distances from antennas were established. Procedures were introduced requiring power reductions or shutdowns during maintenance. Radar sites began positioning exclusion zones and access restrictions, safeguards that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Organizations like OSHA and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering published guidelines acknowledging that uncontrolled microwave exposure wasn't something to ignore. Modern radar systems reflect those lessons. Antennas are better shielded. Transmission paths are more tightly controlled. Automated interlocks prevent maintenance access when systems are energized. Personnel are trained to recognize exposure risks and equipped with procedures that simply didn't exist for earlier generations. The evolution of safety doctrine represents a correction, one that arrived after millions had already served without it. But what these changes quietly concede is that earlier confidence was incomplete. If radar had truly been harmless under all conditions, none of these safeguards would have been necessary. And crucially, the introduction of new standards didn't retroactively solve the problem. Exposure limits protect current and future personnel. They offer little clarity for those already affected. They didn't reconstruct missing exposure data or establish causation decades after the fact. They simply acknowledged that the risk warranted control, which is an admission that's easy to make once the people most at risk are no longer on active duty. When radar exposure is examined through policy, it becomes a paperwork problem. When you examine it through ethics, it becomes something else. The question stops being whether radar met a technical definition of safety at the time, and starts being who absorbs the cost when certainty arrives too late to help the people affected. Modern compensation systems are built around proof. Exposure must be documented. Causation must be established. Conditions must meet predefined criteria. Radar exposure fits poorly into that framework because it was never treated as a hazard when the exposure occurred. The absence of records wasn't an oversight, it was a direct consequence of institutional belief. And when exposure is undocumented, the burden of proof moves from the institution that created the environment to the individual who survived it. This pattern isn't unique to radar. Nuclear test veterans, chemical weapons handlers, burn pit personnel, asbestos-exposed workers, they all encountered the same institutional reflex. Acknowledgement follows evidence. Evidence follows damage. By the time proof exists, responsibility is diluted by time, bureaucracy, and plausible doubt. Institutions often defend this approach as necessary caution. Governments can't compensate based on possibility alone, but ethics doesn't require certainty to recognize obligation. It requires proportional responsibility. When risk is imposed without informed consent, uncertainty shouldn't default against the people who bore it. Radar exposure sits in a narrow space between known harm and plausible risk. That ambiguity has allowed it to remain unresolved for decades. Not officially denied, but not fully acknowledged. Not proven harmless, but not recognized as injurious. Suspended in a bureaucratic limbo where standards improved quietly while past exposure went largely unaddressed. The real ethical failure isn't that radar was deployed without complete knowledge. That's inevitable with any emerging technology. The failure is in how long it took to admit that knowledge was incomplete, and how rigidly institutions held to early assumptions once evidence began to challenge them. In the end, accountability isn't about assigning blame. It's about deciding who absorbs the cost of uncertainty. For radar exposure, that cost was carried by individuals, long after the technology moved on, long after the symptoms were upgraded or scrapped, and long after the institutions involved had the opportunity to do better. Radar operators and technicians almost never appear in war stories. There are no iconic photographs of them charging beaches or climbing into cockpits. Their work was quiet, technical, and constant, watching screens, tuning equipment, keeping systems running that allowed everyone else to fight, navigate, and survive. Their battlefield had no front lines. It had proximity. What this history reveals isn't that radar was a weapon turned inward. It's what happens when technological confidence outruns biological understanding. Radar was deployed because it worked, and it worked extraordinarily well. Safety doctrine lagged not out of malice, but out of assumption. And assumptions, once embedded in policy and practice, are very hard to uproot. There are still things we don't know. Radar exposure doesn't offer the clean clarity of a single cause and effect. It offers probabilities, patterns, and unanswered questions. That ambiguity shouldn't be used as a shield. It should be treated as a reason for humility, and for a more honest accounting of what we ask people to absorb when we hand them a piece of equipment and tell them it's safe. Modern standards exist because someone eventually acknowledged that uncertainty. They protect today's operators in ways that earlier generations never had. That progress matters, but it doesn't erase the past. And for the veterans who spent years standing closest to this technology, the ones now sitting across from claims examiners with files that don't say what they need to say, the question of what was owed to them isn't a paperwork problem. It never was. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which overlooked story you think deserves this treatment. I'll see you in the next one.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?